I find it so totally absurd, that the people who are giving 17, 18-year-olds career advice for how they should, prepare themselves for the next couple years of their lives and probably the rest of their lives have never worked in anything else besides education.
Welcome to the School Sucks Project, a podcast, YouTube channel, and online community dedicated to personal growth and intellectual self-defense.
We promote learning alternatives, home education, critical thinking, peaceful parenting, organization and productivity, and better communication strategies.
Please remember to visit schoolsucksproject.com to get comprehensive show notes, relevant links,
or to just leave comments.
Follow us on Twitter at SchoolSucksShow. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, username School Sucks Podcast, and get involved in our Facebook group. Just search for School Sucks Project.
You don't need to do this. You don't need to jump on the conveyor belt of higher education. You can do something else. Because a lot of teachers, like yourself and like Gatto and others, they know this is something of the system. It's not something of, if we just changed how student loans are done, then, everything would be better, right? It's much more institutionalized.
Yeah. Like there'd be some kind of improvement in the situation if we found government programs to make the entire thing more valueless. Right. That seems to be what was proposed in this most recent election by the left. So I heard. No,
I actually, you know what? If I can just throw it in here, I love the idea of the government just subsidizing college degrees because it means they're going to become even more worthless.
Indeed. Well, yeah, I agree in the long run. I think there's a rough period in between. Like, for example, I have a 16-year-old nephew. Maybe you have people that age in your family. I've said something that contradicts something I've heard you say. When people ask me for advice about going to college, I would say in this climate, the only thing you should consider doing is going to a top school that has a sizable endowment, that can change very, very quickly. Like I went to college for communications in the late 90s. By the time I graduated, my degree was obsolete. The school didn't have the money to update the program for the transfer from analog to digital ways of doing things generally. So if you go to a big school that has a lot of money coming in, they can adapt with the times more readily, and you still graduate with a piece of paper that actually means something. But from your experience, and you are an Ivy League opt-out, you left the University of Pennsylvania, right? You've actually, it seems like from some of the stories I've heard you tell that what I've been saying is bad advice, that in some cases a top school degree can actually be a kind of employment liability. Yeah,
so there's an interesting cultural phenomena at top schools in particular, and in employment. So there's two sides of the issue, right? If you're a young person graduating from a top university, there's this pressure for you to go work at particularly prestigious institutions because anything else is seen as kind of like a waste of your degree. I saw this at Penn. A lot of my classmates, by the time they were sophomores or juniors, they didn't want to go into like investment banking, but most people from Penn actually go into investment banking or consulting. So there's this pressure internally in the school for people to go that way. And, cultures are spontaneous orders. They're products of, human action, but not of human design. So I don't blame any particular person or group of people for this. There's also this hyper-competitive mindset where it's that, I need to be one step ahead of the other people that I am around. Peter Thiel, the PayPal co-founder, talks about this in his book 0 to 1 a lot and really, really hits on that well. The other is on the employment side. Yeah, I have met employers who, if they're looking for somebody who, to do an entry-level sales job and they see someone who graduated from a top school, that can make that person look a little overqualified because the employer is then thinking kind of the flip side of what I just mentioned, where it's like, okay, why is this person coming to apply for a $30,000 a year sales job with my company when I know that they should be able to go get like a consulting job somewhere with like Deloitte or whoever. So that raises some red flags on the employer's side. Mm-hmm. The strength of the signal from the institution really, unless you are going to some of these very highly selective companies, like for example, I think Facebook usually when they're doing on-campus recruiting only recruits from a handful of schools. They will hire dropouts, but you just have to do it through a different kind of a different kind of process. Unless you are really focusing on that, then yeah, the elite degree can be a particularly bad signal, especially if you don't have the opportunity to tell someone like, oh, I got financial aid and I didn't actually have to pay for most of this because Penn, for example, is like $250,000 a year right now.
A year or a year?
I'm sorry, for 4 years, per degree, not a year. Whew. Not yet.
Okay.
But when I see someone who graduates from a school like that, and if I assume that they just paid full tuition, then I just have to wonder, like, what's wrong with this person?
It sounds like for some people there's almost a kind of resignation in, like, they're a freshman, like, say, finance manager, it's a major at somewhere like Columbia.
Yeah.
And they say, I never worked for Goldman Sachs. But by the time they're a junior, that's like the only way forward. That
exactly.
happens a lot. Do you think the schools contribute to that kind of culling or I guess hurting people in that direction? Because these big financial institutions on Wall Street and elsewhere, they rely on these schools. They, they rely on those degree programs to feed their institutions, and they probably even invest a sizable amount of money in getting those young recruits in there for, maybe a low wage considering their worth to the company at first.
Right. Yeah, no, I mean, it's entirely, there's no clear malice here, right? I'm not pointing fingers and saying like anybody's necessarily evil or wrong. Sure. It's entirely rational on the part of, Goldman Sachs or formerly Lehman Brothers, these big institutions, right, up on Wall Street. But I do think the schools do contribute to it culturally. Again, culture is a kind of tricky thing to parse out. If you put a lot of people who are big fish in small ponds into a big pond with a lot of other really big fish, they're going to start focusing on each other and mimicking each other. Yeah. And the result of that is no innovation. The result of that is nobody doing anything new. It's everybody doing what everybody else is doing, right? Mm-hmm. And it's circular. So you end up seeing people. Yeah, I had friends at Penn who they came in their freshman year and they wanted to be entrepreneurs, or they maybe they were a finance major at Wharton and they wanted to go and maybe start their own fintech company someday or something like that. But by the time they're sophomores or juniors or seniors, they all want to go to Goldman Sachs because anything else is seen as a waste of that degree.
Right.
And it's entirely rational for the school. It's entirely rational for these large institutions to go in and try to create that kind of culture. How you fix it, I don't know. If I did, I'd probably be a lot wealthier myself.
Sure. While we're talking about the reasons why institutions do things, and, I feel like I'm going to make all of these things sound more nefarious than they actually are. So you can help me with that.
But Gatto makes this point, right?
Yeah.
In the Underground History, he says, this sounds like a conspiracy. This sounds like a cabal. The scary thing is it's not.
How would you even know how to find this information if you weren't looking? So when you do uncover it, yes, it is very much we never went to the moon type level stuff, Right. Exactly. But it's perfectly rational. So let's talk about the rationale of the colleges themselves. Yeah. And I've heard some of your conversations about the college admissions process. I don't remember what I thought the goals of the college were when I was applying for college in the mid-1990s, like why a college would want me, what their considerations would be. I mean, I understood these things much better when I became a college consultant and an SAT tutor, and just the size of the institution determines the weight they're going to put on metrics like test scores. So if an institution is huge, that's all they're looking at, and if an institution is small and only gets a few thousand applicants a year, they're going to be taking a more holistic look at who you are, obviously, as a person. But when I was in high school, it didn't even occur to me that a college would have an agenda, an admissions department would have an agenda. It was just a school. The school was just the thing you did, and this was just the extension of that. It was just the 13th grade. But what are a college's goals, or at least these upper-level colleges, when it comes to the college admission process? What are their motives?
We need to do away with this notion of like for-profit versus non-profit colleges, right? People ask me all the time, like, oh, is Praxis for-profit or non-profit? And I say we're for-profit, but that's because we think profit and loss are really important signals, and we actually want to report to our customers. At the end of the day, students at whether for-profit colleges, whether they're ITT Tech or Kaplan, or non-profit colleges, whether they're Penn or Pittsburgh or whatever, they're not the customers. They are input. And that's really, really important to understand. The university has an incentive to maximize its endowment. This becomes very, very clear if you understand why people are paid high wages. People are paid wages as a function of the value that they add to the organization that they work at. University presidents make a ton of money. Like Amy Gutmann, who's the president of Penn, makes I think she's probably one of the best paid university presidents in the country. And that's because she's a fundraiser. That's what university presidents are. Nonprofit presidents in general are fundraisers. So the university has an incentive to maximize its endowment. It has a short-term incentive to do that and a long-term incentive to do that. In the short term, that means getting people who are already donating to the organization or people who could donate to the organization, primarily alumni, as well as the government giving grants and student loans, all these other issues. But let's just do it in terms of the endowment, right? Primarily means getting the alumni to actually donate to the university. Well, so how does the admissions department do this? The admissions department has pressure on themselves. It has pressure put on them to admit students who they think if they put them in front of an alumni gala, the alumni will come back and they'll, maybe a week later when they get the phone call from the call center, which is usually staffed by students, they'll pull out the checkbook and be like, man, that was such a great alumni gala. I love, the students that Penn is bringing in now. I feel so warm and fuzzy about it. And then they'll write a $100, $200, $300 check to the university, right? Short-term profit right there. In the long term, that sounds kind of nefarious, but it's true. They love to bring in. This is why it's great to admit people from lower income backgrounds, because you can bring them up and you can say look at what the opportunity we're giving this bright young person that they've been able to work for themselves into. In the long term, the university also has an incentive to admit people that they think will be successful. Universities don't make people successful. I think your listeners would get this, but this is kind of a contrarian idea to a lot of people, because people push their kids to go to schools where they're like, oh, well, successful people went to those schools, so I guess they are successful because they went to those schools. No.
Right.
Universities know to select for people who have certain traits that will lend themselves to being successful later in life.
Right. A lot of legacy stuff there, too, with families, obviously. Successful people go to those schools because they were successful. It's not how they became successful.
Right, exactly. So the university has a long-term incentive to admit students that they think, 20, 30 years down the line will pull out the checkbook after they go to the alumni gala. So, I mean, if I were consulting a college senior right now on their writing their essays to get into college, play up this angle. That's what I would tell them. That's the incentive for the organization. It's to maximize the opportunity for check writing to the endowment.
Mm-hmm. First client I ever had as a tutor was a girl. She was at Boston College, and she was a part-time student, and I was a writing tutor for her. Mm-hmm. She was 27 or 28 years old. She was Vietnamese, and when she was a girl at that time, she had fled the Viet Cong with her family and eventually out of the country. Her writing skills were American elementary school level. And she's at Boston College, and my job was to help her do the application for Harvard University. And I said to the person that I was working for at the time, I said, this girl, unfortunately, her, I don't think this is the right thing. She's like, oh, she'll get into Harvard. The application is a formality. Yep. She'll get in because they love this story. Right. And that's unfortunate that students don't know that, and I think it's a really important thing to know that if you are a certain caliber student or if you fit a certain profile, you are an object of display in many ways. Yeah, perfectly coldly logical, but it's I just remember having a more warm and fuzzy attitude about the higher education experience when I was 17 and filling out a bunch of these applications.
When you go through 12 years of schooling, I totally get why people have that mentality. I find it, kind of going back to what we were talking about a couple minutes ago on employment and employability, I find it so totally absurd that the people who are giving 17, 18-year-olds career advice for how they should, prepare themselves for the next couple years of their lives and probably the rest of their lives have never worked in anything else besides education. whether they're guidance counselors or teachers or their parents who have very little idea of what their students, their children actually want, because the school takes 9 hours of the day from them every single day. Mm-hmm. So I just find it, I've been kicked out of a couple conferences, high school conferences for telling high school students this, where I just tell them, I'm like, look, the people who are giving you advice have no idea what they're talking about.